I'm going to be talking about high-performance computing. High-performance computing, as always, is about people who have bigger computers than you have, and that's more or less the definition. There is always someone who's got a bigger computer than you have, unless there are any Japanese researchers in the audience today. So, no, good. So I can make that as a statement. There's always someone who's got something bigger. But that doesn't mean it's something that isn't relevant, I mean, right throughout the IT ecosystem. And what I'll come back to through this talk, time and time again, is how what's going on in high-performance computing is interesting to register readers, because it's what's going to be going on in commercial computing in 2 years' time. It's what's going to be going on right throughout the industry in 4 or 5 years' time. And this is why high-performance computing always attracts that interest, and that's why it matters. I'm going to be talking about high-performance computing at our research institute. We're a cancer research institute, so that's life sciences research, biology. Biology hasn't traditionally been a computationally driven science. It's typically been driven by people peering down microscopes. So we'll come to how that is changing in the life sciences and how high-performance computing is becoming more and more important throughout biomedical science, throughout life science research in general. So there will be a little bit of science tucked away in the middle of my talk. But the thing is, it's not just us. The things that are driving high-performance computing uptake in the life sciences are driving it throughout the industry. And so what's happening in high-performance computing in the life sciences, where we didn't really need it before and now find we can't do without it, it will come to everyone. It'll come to, it's come to Tesco, it's come to the banks, it comes throughout all of industry. And that's what I'll come back to again and again throughout this talk. So I'm not simply going to talk about semiconductor architectures and so on. I know there's an Intel badge on this, and we're expecting lots and lots of detail about nanometer fabs and so on. I'm not really going to be talking about that so much, but some of the implications of silicon are very important. I'll talk about what high-performance computing is and what our definition of that is, so that we know what we're all talking about. And some of the background to it and how we've got to where we are today. I'll talk about some of the challenges in getting high-performance computing to work, because it's not straightforward. It's not something you just buy out of the box and crank some sort of handle, and there you've got high-performance computing working. And it's not just about the processors, as I've said. I'll talk a little bit about our own institute here. So biomedical science suddenly needs HPC. Why is that? You suddenly need it. Does this mean all the rest of us are going to need it too? To which the answer is, well, kind of yes. And for our small institute with restricted budgets, we had to deal with high-performance computing. We had to take it on. We had to turn a basic IT department into a high-performance computing department. How do you go about doing that? What sort of technologies did we use? So I'll take you through all of that as well. So one of the key things, actually, is here. It's the people who do high-performance computing, the people who do scientific computing, actually turns out to be one of the key things. So here's who I am. But actually, who all of the people in my department are is quite an interesting question. Where do you find the people who've got the right skill set to be able to program a massively parallel machine, to handle the networking, to look after the software, to put it all into a box, and deliver it at a price that the researchers can afford? So this is quite a profound issue, what these CVs look like. So who am I in particular, and why are you listening to me? So I'm the head of IT and scientific computing, Cancer Research UK in Cambridge. I've picked out some of the relevant bits there. The first thing is, how do you get someone who's a scientific computing expert at all? Very few people go out and do a first degree in scientific computing. You do a first degree in a science, or you do a first degree in computing. At some point, those have to cross over. So that's the first problem. You don't get graduates who have all the skills that you need to be able to do this. You have to find someone who's got some higher degree. So, I mean, typically, you'll have a master's degree, or in my case, a PhD, where you combine science and computing, and you get to spend a couple of years just absorbing the technology and the crossover between the two different subjects. That's a problem if you want to drive a whole industry. How do you get trained scientific computing experts when historically everything's just grown up by osmosis. You'll notice our department is split. We call ourselves IT and scientific computing. In fact, we're one department, and all the staff are members of the same department. There's sometimes splits between your physics department and your IT department in a university, for example. The high-performance computers will all end up tucked away in the basement of the physics department. We've tried to merge that together a little. We provide the same infrastructure, the same virtualization infrastructure that runs our websites at the Institute, is using the same technology that our HPC is based on. And trying to get that convergence reduces the overhead, reduces the number of scientific computing experts, the number of IT people you need, which for us is crucial, because of course that means we're spending more money on researchers and less money on IT, which is great. That's what I want us to be doing. The fact that we work for Cancer Research UK is quite crucial. So we need high-performance computing. We're not doing this out of pride. We're not doing this, to get ourselves up some ranking table somewhere. We're using high-performance computing because we can't do our research without it. We're spending the money on high-performance computing that we have to spend on high-performance computing. So that's quite interesting, looking at what the compromises you make and what the challenges are, trying to deliver it within a low-cost environment. And finally, we're at the Cambridge Research Institute. That's relevant because Cambridge is a center for genetics, obviously. Cambridgeshire has got some of the large-scale facilities for handling big genetic data sets. Historically, the Sanger Center, the European Bioinformatics Institute. And of course, Cambridge is a center for mathematical and biomedical research based on analytical tools. So we've got lots and lots of researchers now. Around about 20% of our researchers are actually computational, whereas in the past they would all have been lab coat-wearing biologists or medics. So that really drives the sort of research that's going on at the Institute. Myself, I'm older than I look, and in the past I used to work for the National Supercomputer Facility at Edinburgh Parallel Computing Centre. So before diverting into life sciences, I spent time running a large-scale national HPC facility. Edinburgh still runs the UK's national HPC facility. And I've worked at the European Bioinformatics Institute. So it used to be that this sort of high-end computational life science went into a sort of ivory tower in a specialist institute, of which there was one in Europe. Now that has sort of bled out. So every research group now will have a bioinformatician. Every research institution will have a little team of people squirreling away, trying to work out how to deal with, suddenly I've got 100 terabytes of data. Suddenly I need 500 cores in my basement. And that's spreading out throughout the industry as it becomes more computational. So what's our definition of high-performance computing? I mean, one really trivial definition is to say, if you go out to PC World and you can buy it, then it probably doesn't count as high-performance computing. The interesting thing about that is it's quite a consistent definition, although it moves, and we'll look at how that barrier moves a little bit. It remains a fairly consistent definition. So what does high-performance computing mean? High-performance computing means fast processors. So in the early days of HPC, lots and lots of work went into speeding up silicon, making the chips faster. So vector processing, where you put lots of operations together, reduced instruction set processing, where you trim down the number of steps and clean up your pipelines. Pipelining itself so that you can get as many floating point operations per cycle as possible. All of these things were really pushed to their limits back in the 80s by the original supercomputer manufacturers. And all of those technologies then made it through into what became the commodity processors. And you know what? We got nearly as fast as we could. I mean, the basic CPU units haven't been that optimized since then. And most of the work has gone on to improving the silicon to make the chips faster. But there we're getting limits as well, because there's a limit to how hot you can let your chip get if you're going to be running it in an air-cooled environment. And then you reach your limit. So boom, if that was it, Moore's law we'd have been off the curve several years ago. So then, to get more out of your machine, you have to put multiple processors together. And that's obvious. You can make it twice as fast by putting 2 processors in it. But immediately you're hit by a problem, which is my software was written for a single processor. So immediately you hit this wall where you have to start rewriting your code to take advantage of multiple processors. And then the chip manufacturers start putting multiple cores onto individual chips. In some ways, that's easier. You rewrite your code by multi-threading it instead of parallelizing it. But in some ways, it's harder. If any of you are computer scientists here or programmers, mutex locks, thread-safe coding, actually, that's one of the advanced courses in computing science. People often fail that module. It's not straightforward to write really good multi-threaded code. And what we've got now are processors which are parallelized and multi-core. So you've got different performance depending on how your chips are laid out, how your processors are laid out, and how the nodes in your supercomputer are laid out. And how do you program to take advantage of all of those different issues? This is a real problem. It isn't a solved problem either. There's lots of work gone into compilers, lots of theoretical work being done over the years, but at the end of the day, it's about understanding your code, understanding how it works, and rewriting it to take advantage of those processors. So this is a problem. You also need memory. So high memory is one of the characteristics of a supercomputer, having the data close to the processor. And again, you can put more and more RAM in, but you start being limited. As you parallelize your code, you can have shared memory, so the individual processors are sharing large blocks of memory. Again, quite difficult to program for. You've got to look at thread safety. If you've got multiple nodes, you want to connect them together, you could put in memory interconnects. And memory interconnects allow you to build huge machines, which have got huge amounts of aggregate memory. And you can go out and you can buy these now. There's support for them built into the operating systems as well. But yet again, there's an issue. You've got data locality. You've got little pockets of data out associated with individual chips. You can write your code to take advantage of all the memory, but as soon as your data starts getting pushed off onto a more distant chip, it's going to take you longer to get at that data. So coding for one of these non-uniform memory architectures, very complicated. We've put together multiple processors. We need fast interconnects. So obviously, that's one of the things we need. We've got to get data in and out of this machine, so we need fast disk associated with it as well. So here we go. We've got fast processors, high memory, fast interconnect. These are all relative terms. For it to count as HPC, what I mean is this is slightly faster than you could get out of a standard workstation. So let's take a little trip down memory lane back to 1993 when I was a young lad starting out in high-performance computing. This is what a supercomputer looked like in those days. These were the glory days. You would buy a big red box from Cray, and it meant that your country was up at the top there. And it meant everything was great. But already things had started to go wrong for supercomputers. This is a Cray T3D, so this one had 128 processors inside it. But those processors, although they were connected with a specialist Cray interconnect, those were commodity DEC alpha processors. And this was the first time that the supercomputers up at the top had started to realize that they were going to have to start building their components out of commodity. Otherwise, it was all going to go wrong for them. So the Cray T3D, kind of the end of the glory days of a specialist supercomputer and the start of what all supercomputing is now based on, which is some combination of commodity architecture with some specialist advanced stuff to wire it together and make it work. And that's the route we've gone down. But back in 1993, this was the UK's top machine, 19 gigaflops, would have been well placed in the top 500. So I can't take the credit for this. This is Jack Dongara and co.'s work based over the last 20 years, collating the top 500 supercomputing systems. And doing it properly as well, not just taking the marketing literature, but all of these machines have been properly benchmarked. So this is the actual floating point performance they get. Already this slide's out of date, but last year the top machine was the Riken K machine at 8 petaflops up there. So that blue curve with the red dots on it, that's the #1 computer in the world. What's interesting about this graph is that if you look at the number one computer in the world, that's where governments are saying, I need to do high-performance computing, so I'm really going to push the boat out. I'm going to spend all my money, and we're going to buy something which blows everyone else off the map. There's politics behind that and economics behind it as much as science. And you can see it sort of stepwise. So people will jump off the curve, and then their machine will stay top for 3 or 4 years at a time. And in fact, the K machine is still top, although it's just been made slightly bigger to keep itself ahead of the curve. What's much more interesting is if you look at the average of the top 500, the top green boxes there, or the bottom of the top 500 there, the purple boxes down at the bottom there. So the purple boxes, that's what it takes for you to count as high-performance computing this year. So last year, you'd have needed a 40 teraflop machine to get into the top 500. And if you look at how consistent that line is, how very close to the straight line on this log curve it is, the machine down at the bottom is actually being driven by proper, genuine economics. It's being driven by actual Moore's law. It's being driven by what's possible and what's affordable. And somewhere in between is what most high-performance computing looks like today. So that's telling us that actually we're going to consistently move up that curve. We can sort of disregard the number one because there's a lot of things going on there. But if we look at the number 500 spot, that's what's happening in high-performance computing. And it's been very consistent. It's driven by faster chip speeds. It's driven by multi-core. It's driven by parallelism. It's driven by interconnects. But it is driven, and it's driven fairly consistently. Those lines are a fairly impressive trend that you can follow. Now, if we look at where our Cray T3D was back in 1993, about 19 gigaflops. So it was comfortably up between the purple and the red box there. If you look at where it is today, of course, it would fall off the curve completely. It would have dropped out of the top 500 around about 1999. And I told you, this is not high-performance computing, but this is the machine which we have on our desks. So this is the desktop machine. OK, we buy them from Dell. We don't go to PC World. This is what's not high-performance computing today. But what's this got inside it? Well, if your head of IT is nice to you, it's got 2 processors inside it. If you've got one of the new ones, those 2 processors have got 6 cores inside them. So already there's 12 processors inside here. I can stuff quite a lot of memory inside that. You pay for it yourself, but you can stuff quite a lot of memory inside it as well. So we've got a machine here which can be benchmarked at around about 10 gigaflops. And that's what I've said isn't high-performance computing anymore. And here it is. So there's my desktop. Now, if you look, of course, at where this would have been back in 1993, comfortably in the top 500. And in fact, comfortably in the top 500 right up until the mid-90s. And the reason this is relevant, I'm not just being cute, the reason this is relevant is that my machine does not run all 12 of its cores all the time. In fact, my machine very rarely touches more than 4 of its cores. Partly because I'm not doing computational science, I'm running Word documents, partly because it's really, really difficult to get code that will use all those cores. And this is an issue now, because if my desktop is only going to get faster by stuffing more cores in and by changing its architecture and becoming more complicated, if I'm actually going to see those year-on-year improvements that we've been used to seeing out of Moore's law and everything else, actually we're going to have to start learning from high-performance computing. We're going to have to start adapting and programming our equipment the way we've been programming supercomputers. It was not easy to program a Cray T3D. You had to think quite hard about it, and you had to throw away a lot of your pre-existing code. The same will happen. And it doesn't just matter for my desktop. OK, now I am being cute. This is my phone. Now my phone inside it has got a gigahertz chip. OK, it's only a 32-bit chip, and I haven't benchmarked it. It's not giving me a gigaflop of performance here. But that's a very fast chip. And the same thing is happening to my phone as is happening to everything else. We will have multi-core in our phone. We will have complicated memory architectures in our phone. And we will hit a point where all of our devices suddenly start to become really complicated. How do you program when you've got multi-layer memory architectures? How do you program if everything's multi-core? I don't know, but we're all going to have to do it. So there's my phone. So this is an issue. So high-performance computing trickles down. The things that we were doing that we were finding hard 20 years ago now, everyone has to do to get anything out of computing these days. Eventually, there won't be a single device that doesn't have to take into account all the things that we've learned from high-performance computing. So, I'm not the only person thinking about this. In fact, even the UK government is thinking about this. High-performance computing tends to go in trends. You get phrases like the grid was popular 7 or 8 years ago. The US tried to adopt cyber infrastructure, although I don't think people really took to it because it sounded a bit weird. The UK government currently are using the phrase e-infrastructure to talk about high-performance computing and its associated environment. But what's interesting, so they produced a review this year, and the review looked at e-infrastructure, meaning high-performance computing and networking. And they picked out this set of key areas that I've highlighted here. And what's interesting is that computing, silicon, isn't necessarily at the top of their list or even their priority. It's kind of assumed now that chip manufacturers are going to keep producing new silicon for us. But look at the other things that have been picked up there. So networks. I'll talk about networks a little bit and see how we deal with networking in this context. People and skills. And it keeps coming back to people and skills. People and skills. How are people trained to program in the UK? Will they be able to take advantage of this technology? Will we actually be able to use it as it arrives? Data. Everything's being driven by data now. So in the days when everything was about computation, everything was about linear algebra, those days are kind of gone. Really what's driving high-performance computing, certainly for us, probably everywhere else, is data as it arrives, as it gets captured. Yes, we'll talk about computation, but we'll worry about software. How on earth do we get our software to work on these more complicated architectures? And authentication and security, they've picked out as a specialist topic as well. As we move to, let's call it the cloud, as we move to a distributed environment, of course we've called it a dozen different things over the last 10 years. How do you start building these scale-out infrastructures where not everything's in one data center, where not everything is owned by one person? So I'll go through some of these in a little more detail. Networking, for example. So what makes a high-performance computing network? So if you look at the processors themselves, there's a number of ways you can wire it together. The simplest thing is to build a Beowulf-style cluster. So you take commodity processors, wire them together, and stick gigabit Ethernet in, and put in a powerful switch, but a standard Ethernet switch to connect that all together. That works fine. It doesn't necessarily push you up into top 500 scale, but for loosely coupled parallel computing, it works okay. And this is what we use at Cambridge at the moment. For that style of computing, really, the gold standard is InfiniBand, which is a low latency protocol. Slightly different, more like layer 2 Ethernet with a specialist software stack that sits on top of it. But again, it's a commodity. You can buy it from several manufacturers, and most of your computers will now come with adapters that will let it talk to InfiniBand. Good for storage, good for parallel computing, MPI-style computing. I've highlighted 10 gig Ethernet here as well, because what will happen as we move from gigabit Ethernet to 10 gig Ethernet is that 10 gig Ethernet will start appearing everywhere. And as it gets put into your commodity processors, into your commodity machines, it will become cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And it doesn't have the low latency of InfiniBand, but there are ways that you can mask the latency. And the fact that it's so cheap and that its bandwidth is so high will mean that eventually gigabit Ethernet will probably take over and will be the standard for most cluster-style computing. You can still go to a supercomputer manufacturer. You can still buy a specialist memory interconnect. And these things still exist. Some of the top 500 have got these architectures. Cray still exists and sell these. Bull in France will sell you equipment that's got a specialist memory interconnect as well. Also, if you're in high-performance computing, you're doing a lot of work, you've got to worry about how you get the data in and out from the outside world. So in the UK, we have the Janet academic network. Actually, that's relatively good. You can get 10 gig links between most of the cities in the UK if you need them. And there are technologies that will let you take advantage of bundled links as well. So we've got our friends from physics world coming in later who will talk about how they move huge amounts of data around Europe for their CERN experiments. And the protocol things that you can do there as well. Often the biggest problem is that last 10 yards. So I've got a 10 gig Janet pipe running into my university, but I can't stop my university from putting in a 1 gig firewall between me and Janet. So, how do I actually get the last links that make my data perform is often the problem, and I'll show you a nice example of that. People and skills. So people and skills is crucial. So where do IT staff come from? Certainly in the UK, there seem to be 3 routes that IT staff come to us. The first is someone does something else, and then they get into IT. And they pick up some Microsoft certification, or they do some desktop support, and they sort of drift into it. But eventually they get good at it, and after 20 years, you can be a systems architect through that route, and you get plenty of good IT people who come that way. But of course, nowhere through that route do you get your hands on a supercomputer. Nowhere through that do you start dealing with really large data systems. So that's a problem. Now, the computer scientists, they know the theory because they've done it as an undergraduate. They've seen it all on a blackboard. They tend to go off into software engineering type jobs and often don't get their hands on a lot of hardware. So we tend to find the computer scientists end up quite high up the ecosystem, looking at software, looking at distributed systems, often very good at building sort of web-based architectures. Your Google engineers come through that route mostly, but often not very good at actually wiring together plugs and things, working out how to build complex systems. And the classic route for high-performance computing, obviously the route I came through, but a lot of our staff came through, is you start off doing research. Your research requires high-performance computing. You start spending more time in the computer room. You become a systems administrator. 20 years later, you find yourself doing HPC instead of, I did a science degree. Shouldn't I be doing science? But that's the route a lot of our staff have come through. So the skills issues for HPC are really, we want that full set there. We want people who are trained IT professionals. We want people who've got the basic underpinning, the computer science understanding. And we want people who've had to mess around with complicated storage, difficult networking problems, and advanced programming, who could do parallel multi-threaded coding. So having a career path which ends up with people with the right set of skills is an issue. And it's not a solved issue, it's just an issue in the UK at the moment. And how do you convince a person who's going down this route that they'll have a job in 4 or 5 years' time? What does that career path look like? So we've got data problems. So back 20 years ago, most of what high-performance computing was doing was simulation, numerical analysis, small amount of data, large amount of compute, very easy to handle. Now most of our work is being driven by data. So sensors, silicon put out into our sensor devices, collecting a lot more data. Image capture. So lots of the work in biology is being driven by CCDs. So lots and lots of data coming in from CCD data sources. And the internet, of course. People are going to put up this Internet of Things. Suddenly all these things are going to start talking. We're going to have huge amounts of data to deal with. This is a problem. In high-performance computing, there's a number of different things you have to do to give yourself a good storage system. You need high-speed, low-latency storage that will talk to 500, 600, 1,000 cores simultaneously. You need storage which will allow you to have sustained parallel throughput, and you need to be able to store huge amounts of data. I've put those in as 3 separate bullet points. Unfortunately, there are 3 separate approaches. There's no one storage architecture which bites off all 3 of these yet. So there's a lot of work still to do in storage. Computation itself, as I've said, it's being driven by commodity computing. The idea of vector computers and SIMD computers that was very big 30 years ago, except that now starts appearing back in the GPU co-processors we've got. Really, it's commodity processors that drive it all. Floating point performance, multi-core architectures. GPUs are becoming mainstream, and they're built off graphics cards, so there's an ecosystem supporting it. But how do you program for a hybrid GPU-CPU machine? And we've got the constraints as well, of course. We've got power constraints for all of these processors, memory bandwidth constraints on our processors. But it comes down to programmability. As we push the problem around the chip, around the die, and around our supercomputer, how do we actually get that peak performance that we're after? And this means we need software. So you need to be able to parallelize your code. This is still an advanced topic in most programming courses. It's not standard. You need scalability as well as parallelism. So you've got Amdahl's law. You can't have any one part of your code which is bottlenecking everything else. So you need to be able to cope with these multi-core architectures with multi-level caches and I/O scalability as well. And this is a problem because it's difficult to scale up to 128 processors, 256 processors. How on earth are we going to be scaling up to exascale as we get exascale computers available? In some cases, we're actually going to have to go back and rewrite our science. There are algorithms that just will not scale to 1,000 processors. So we're going to have to think about redoing the way that we do science right from the start. So this is an issue that's going to go right back to the core. And this whole thing about high-performance computing have to be fed back in to the minds of everyone at the point where they're undergraduates, thinking about how I'm going to do my science to take advantage of the computers that are going to be available at the end of the process. And I won't talk too much about authentication and security, but still it's surprising how many of our facilities are based on this idea that you own the facility, you give out the username, you give out the passwords. Even Amazon works because they give out the username, they give out the password. You can use their whole system. Now, in the real world, we need some sort of infrastructure which has distributed trust. We can't have every facility working with every other facility, managing everyone else's users. We don't really want a central database of users. And there are approaches. There have been public key infrastructures which have been tried in the past, a little difficult to manage. And there are now some good developments in federated authentication, where I say, well, I don't necessarily know everyone from Cambridge University and from Oxford University, but I'll trust Cambridge University and Oxford University's IT department to manage the users and the passwords. So there are now federated authentication systems which can be used to link together different systems. And we're making some good progress in that area. I'll talk about that briefly at the end. So these are all the issues in high-performance computing. It's not just about going out and buying a block of silicon which runs stuff very fast. It's not even just about going out to one computer manufacturer and saying, give me a supercomputer. I'm going to be building a cluster. I'm going to be doing the networking. I'm going to be trying to work out how to program it. So how does this affect us at Cancer Research UK? Why do we care about this? So here's our institute, beautiful cloud-free sky. Here, of course, is the IT and scientific computing department, as you would expect, tucked away in the basement with 100 square meters, constrained by power, constrained by space, constrained by the amount of cooling that we can get out, constrained by daylight. So all the standard problems that you'd have running any data center. And up on the top floors are the scientists themselves. And what's the problem? So here's one of my favorite clever devices, the confocal microscope, which uses the optics that you're using to look at the cell to send in a laser to light up the cell at the same time. Great, except for us that means you can light up the cell slice by slice, and that means you can generate three-dimensional data out of your microscope. So I've taken what was a couple of gigabytes, and I've just multiplied it by 10 or 50. Of course, nowadays you can do video capture as well, so then suddenly I've got a machine which can generate a terabyte of data in a couple of hours, if we really want to run it that way. And here we're only limited by the analysis software. The only reason our 22 microscopes don't generate 22 terabytes of data a week is that there isn't yet the software to analyze that data. But it will come. And that's not enough. So they've already got a microscope. They want to attach it to a robot. So the robot will feed through slides and will process hundreds and hundreds of images a night. And the individual slides, they parallelize onto the slides individual samples. So we now have a robot which is running hundreds of slides every night with hundreds of parallelized samples on each slide, and all the data is accumulating. All the data has to be stored. All the data has to be analyzed. So again, our pathology facility generating terabytes of data every week. All has to be kept, looked after, and analyzed. And then the daddy of it all is DNA sequencing. You all remember the Human Genome Project? All of the world's scientists worked for 10 years to produce a single human genome, announced in 2001, went on the news. It doesn't go on the news anymore when someone does that. And the reason is that all of the world's scientists and all of that 10 years of work can now be done by one technician standing in front of the blue box there. It would take this blue box, an Illumina genome analyzer, just a few days to fully sequence the human genome. And that sequence comes to us, it's 500 gigabytes of data. And we can now sequence routinely thousands and thousands of samples. So tens, hundreds of terabytes of data, petabytes of data coming in to underpin our science. And again, what's at the heart of it? Actually, the sequencing has been parallelized. There's a CCD camera at the center of it all, and these individual dots are the individual sequencing runs that are going on. So how do we deal with it? We'll go through all those different areas. So we need networks. So the first thing is the networking itself. We've got a cluster, and the cluster is just built on gigabit Ethernet. It's relatively cheap, and our problems parallelize quite well, so we don't need InfiniBand. I'd like InfiniBand. At some point, we'll put InfiniBand into some of our blade clusters. But for now, we've got a blade enclosure, which is just running gigabit Ethernet. It works fine for us. We've got hundreds of terabytes of sequence data that's being sequenced by our partners and which is coming into the building. And how does that arrive in the building? Yes, that's a cardboard box there. Technically, those aren't sneakers. Those are my shoes, but I didn't carry the box. So we will get sequencing runs coming from outside organizations. It's still faster for them to come in an external 3 terabyte USB drive, and then we feed it into the front of our unit. Not because networking doesn't exist, but simply the practicalities of it, the cost of it, the time scale of it. A lot of data is still moving around the planet in cardboard boxes and on USB disks. People and skills, so we've got a team of system administrators. And here we see we've got computer scientists or an engineer who's gone the Microsoft certified route. And we've got some people who've come the traditional HPC route. Myself, a chemist, we've got a physicist, and we've got a medical physicist as well. So we haven't quite broken that. We've tried to merge the department together. Hopefully the computer scientists are learning the HPC skills. The HPC people obviously are being professionalized by the IT people. But we still haven't yet found, a good source of HPC people. We're having to train them up in-house. How do we handle data at the CRI? Well, we need high parallel throughput storage. So for that, we use the Lustre file system. So we've got a 96 terabyte Lustre file system. That gives you a good parallel distributed system with good throughput across a 1,000 core cluster. So that works okay for us. But it's quite expensive. Per terabyte, it's quite expensive to put that in. So what you also need at the other end is somewhere to store all of the data. So we're generating 200 terabytes per year. We're now parts of projects which are going to be bringing in 300, 400 terabytes over a 1-year period. So we need petascale file systems. Fortunately, there are now high-density storage solutions, and there are a number of different scale-out file systems where you can just add blocks of storage in, and theoretically can scale out. The iBrick system, for example, is being tested up to 16 petabytes, and theoretically can scale much further. So there are now file systems which are dense enough that a relatively small facility like ours, we should be able to fit 2 petabytes into our basement over the next few years without too much problem. There's a whole set of things to worry about on top of that. If I've got that much data, how do I index it? How do I give it back to people? How do I share it with other people? But for now, we're happy just to know that it's safe and it's backed up somewhere. Computation itself, of course, almost as a side issue, we use Hewlett-Packard blade-based architecture. We've got 64 two-socket, 4-core machines, and we've got 16 doubled two-socket, 6-core machines as well. So overall, that gives us a bit over 1,000 cores in our basement, consuming about 40 kilowatts of power, generates quite a lot of heat. You want the cooling to be working, if at all possible, and the LSF scheduler over the top of it. So a fairly standard cluster environment, works fairly well, and lets us do the image analysis, the sequencing work, all through one single shared infrastructure. We've got problems with software. We don't develop our own software. We're not a bioinformatics institute, we're a cancer research institute. So we bring in codes that are being used for image processing. We bring in codes that are being used for systems biology. A lot of these codes are R scripts, Perl scripts, Python scripts, shell scripts. So this isn't well-written, carefully engineered engineering software. This is randomly put together pipelines. The pipelines themselves often parallelize well, but the core algorithms, often no work has been put into parallelizing them at all. And if it has, it's been done by a biologist, not by an engineer or a computer scientist. So we've got an issue that we have to deal with here that we're looking at quite hard. How do we optimize this code without actually becoming a software house ourselves? So there's a whole set of things you could do. Resource optimization, making sure that your code is spread across the cluster properly, is using the different layers of storage appropriately, and that you've actually mapped your pipeline onto the performance of your system. Code optimization itself, although that can be really difficult because if you can't get at the source code or don't understand the source code, it's difficult to pull it apart, parallelize it, multi-thread it. Algorithm design, for those people who are writing their own software, again, this thing where you actually have to look at the maths before you start doing the science to work out what's going to scale out onto a parallel machine. Hardware selection itself, so we're an approachable IT department. We can change the memory layout. We can change the different layers of storage that we've got. Frameworks will become a bigger and a bigger thing. There's no way to get exascale scale out without adapting your code to take advantage of the frameworks that allow you to push out millions of jobs to gather back the data. Doing map-reduce work, we know scales. So the more we can make use of those frameworks, the better it will be. And of course, training people. So we won't be able to do all of these things. We're focusing our effort on the top one, resource optimization. I hope that I can pull apart your pipeline and map it onto our system as efficiently as possible. And down at the bottom, training. I hope that I can show you that there's a literature about parallel computing, high-performance computing, and algorithm design, and I hope you're going to start learning from it. And then finally, authentication and security. So within the CRI, it's exactly as I described it. We'll give you a password, you can log in. You can SSH in from outside if I trust you enough. What we'd really like to be able to do is take all of the cancer research institutes in the UK, the 5 major ones I've picked out here, and we'd like to be able to share facilities. We'd like to be able to pool our HPC resources. We'd like to be able to use each other's storage. Now, as I said, there are now federated authentication systems. We're working with Janet on their Project Moonshot, for example, which will allow you to take multiple Active Directory instances and federate them together so you can build a trust network across the organization. And then we'll be able to have file systems, processors that can be accessed by all of our researchers without us having to merge all of our departments into one super department, which is not necessarily the best way to do this. So I'll stop there. And the key things I hope that I've explained is, first of all, high-performance computing is a relative term. It just means higher than what you can get from PC World. But what that means is that, of course, today's high-performance computing developments will become absolutely mainstream computing in just a few years' time. So what's going on in HPC, as the registers say, it's relevant to everybody. It depends as much on the people as it depends on the technology. So none of this is going to work unless there's a generation of skilled engineers who understand the complexity, are willing to look at everything from storage systems up to code optimization, algorithm design. And it asks us all some really hard questions, because as I say, it's not at all clear that if you gave my researchers that top-end Japanese machine, that we'd be able to squeeze the performance out of it, that we'd actually be able to make it work, and that we'd actually be gaining 8 petaflops of performance. It's hard to program for these machines. But we're looking at a future, by 2020, where all of our computing architectures are as complex as this. So if we're really going to be getting the benefit of our future computing facilities, we're all going to have to start adapting to worrying about this problem. Is our software going to scale? Are our systems going to scale? Is our current approach to computing still going to be working for us in 10 years' time when we all have to worry about these things? So with that, I'll stop.